Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating premise. The idea that a single historical pivot point in 1492 set off a massive global series of dominoes. Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic didn't just connect two continents, it triggered a chain reaction. We're talking an unprecedented collision of biology, climate, economics, and culture that literally rewired the entire world. Okay, so let's kick things off with an absolutely staggering number, 90%. That is the estimated percentage of the population lost in many areas of the Americas following European contact. 90%. It's a number so huge it's honestly kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? But it really is the foundational shockwave for our whole explainer today. Because this demographic collapse didn't just affect the people living in the Americas. As we'll see, the effects of this echoed across the entire globe in ways you'd probably never expect.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Columbian Exchange, then move to the Great Dying, the Little Ice Age, plantations and slave labor, the caste system, and wrap up with the modern legacy.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Columbian Exchange. So historian Alfred W. Crosby actually coined the term Columbian Exchange back in 1972. And what's really fascinating about his work is that he pointed out 1492 wasn't just a simple meeting of people. No, it was a sudden, violent collision of entirely separate ecosystems. Think about it. For thousands of years, the Old World and a New World developed in complete isolation from one another. Then suddenly, you have cultivated plants, domestic animals, human cultures, and critically, microscopic pathogens just flying back and forth across the Atlantic. This concept basically founded the field of environmental history because it proved that human history is just totally inextricably linked to biological exchange.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Great Dying. Before European contact, the pre-Columbian population of the New World was massive, estimated to be anywhere from 60 to 80 million people, complete with huge, complex empires like the Aztecs and the Incas. But because these populations had been completely isolated from the rest of the world, their immune systems just didn't have the defenses needed to fight off Old World diseases. So when Europeans arrived, they brought along smallpox, measles, typhus, bubonic plague, and influenza. And the result? It was absolutely catastrophic. Entire communities across the Caribbean practically vanished within just 50 years. And many people didn't just die directly from the diseases themselves, but from starvation because the communities were simply too weak to even prepare food.
To put the sheer scale of this tragedy into perspective, just look at central Mexico. Before Columbus, the population there was estimated to be between 10 to 20 million people. But following back-to-back outbreaks of smallpox and a mysterious, highly lethal hemorrhagic fever called cocolistli, the population just plummeted. By 1650, it had crashed to barely 1 million. Going from maybe 20 million to 1 million, it's a demographic collapse of truly unprecedented proportions. Now, let's look at a really surprising ripple effect in Section 3, the Little Ice Age. Okay, so the Little Ice Age was this period of unusually low temperatures observed mostly in the Northern Hemisphere from the 13th to the 19th centuries. And while things like volcanic activity and sunspots definitely played a role, recent science points to a pretty startling connection directly to the Americas. Think about it. The Great Dying meant that literally millions of farmers were suddenly just gone. So, step 1, the traditional slash-and-burn farming practiced across the Americas suddenly stops. Step 2, wild plant life and forests rapidly reclaim all that massive amount of abandoned farmland. Step 3, this explosive growth of new trees and vegetation acted as a giant carbon sink, pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide, a key greenhouse gas, right out of the atmosphere. And the final step? Well, a sudden drop in atmospheric CO2 leads directly to global cooling. A human tragedy in the Americas literally altered the Earth's atmosphere. How wild is that? And this global cooling had a very real, tangible impact over in Europe. The River Thames in London literally froze solid. People actually set up tents and played games right on the ice. But it wasn't all fun and games. The peak of this Little Ice Age in the 17th century led to what scholars call the general crisis. Across Europe and China, you had these wet, cold summers and severe droughts that totally destroyed crops. Food prices skyrocketed, malnutrition triggered new disease outbreaks, and this severe environmental stress even contributed to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in China. Moving on to Section 4, plantations and slave labor. To really understand the colonial economy that emerged, we have to trace the journey of one very specific, incredibly labor-intensive crop, sugar. Now, sugar wasn't native to Europe. European crusaders first really engaged with sugar plantations way back in the 12th century around Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. From there, Italian merchants moved production over to islands like Cyprus and Sicily.
Fast forward to the 15th century, and the Portuguese are pushing production along the coast of West Africa. Finally, following 1492, the whole enterprise leaps across the Atlantic, taking root in the vast fertile lands of Brazil and the West Indies. And it's absolutely crucial to realize that this immense demand for sugar built a highly specific and frankly brutal economic machine. Historian Philip D. Curtin outlines a few key characteristics of these early plantations. First and foremost, they relied entirely on slave labor. Second, the enslaved populations were non-self-sustaining. The working conditions were so harsh and death rates were so incredibly high that the workforce constantly had to be replenished via the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. These were massive, heavily capitalized farms geared entirely toward exporting goods back to Europe. Yet, they were managed with almost feudal authority by the owners on the ground, all while being politically controlled by distant empires in Europe. It was an economic model that fundamentally reshaped human demographics across multiple continents. Which leads us to Section 5, the casta system. So, in 18th century New Spain, what we now call Mexico, the Spanish colonial government was trying to maintain control over a rapidly mixing population. Their solution was instituting the casta system. This was a strict socioeconomic ranking, and they actually authenticated it through a unique genre of colonial art known as casta paintings. In these paintings, you'll notice how clothing was used to distinguish status. The Spanish man is depicted wearing a European wig and coat, while the indigenous woman wears a traditional embroidered blouse called a huipil. This art wasn't just decorative, it was a direct calculated tool of social classification. To enforce this rigid hierarchy, the Spanish developed a highly subjective, completely pseudoscientific set of what we might call casta equations. For example, a Spaniard and an Indian produced a mestizo. A Spaniard and a black individual produced a mulatto. But these labels became incredibly, almost obsessively specific, and in many cases deeply derogatory. For instance, someone with a certain mixed background might be labeled a torna atroz, which literally translates to a step back. It heavily implied that mixing away from Spanish lineage was a regression. And while these categories were often based more on physical appearance or personal wealth rather than actual genetics, they rigidly dictated your entire life, what jobs you could hold, exactly where you could live, and even what specific clothes you were legally allowed to wear. These beliefs penetrated deeply into everyday life, right down to how intimate domestic scenes were portrayed. During this era, which was heavily influenced by the European Enlightenment, there was actually a widespread pseudoscientific fear regarding wet nurses. Europeans legitimately believed that breast milk contained the literal physical humors and character traits of the woman producing it. So there was a genuine discriminatory fear that a non-Spanish wet nurse would physically pass on bad traits to a Spanish child. Because of this, you rarely ever see wet nurses depicted in casta paintings. Instead, they show mothers nursing their own children, carefully reinforcing these colonial ideas of lineage and blood purity. And finally, we arrive at Section 6, the modern legacy. The echoes of all these historical dominoes, they are very much alive today. While the formal legal casta system is long gone, researchers note that its underlying attitudes still heavily influence social dynamics across Latin America. Even today, there are ongoing, highly complex debates over mestizaje, the mixing of races. Some nations celebrate it as a beautiful, unifying national identity, while critics point out that this narrative can sometimes obscure the very real, ongoing discrimination against Black and Indigenous populations. Furthermore, that brutal plantation model established back in the 16th century, it laid the absolute groundwork for the massive, export-driven, globalized agricultural economies that supply our local supermarkets right now. So we're left with a pretty vital question. Are we still living in the world that 1492 created? When you look at the carbon levels in our atmosphere, the demographics of the Americas, and the massive global trade networks that move our food every single day, the answer seems to be a resounding yes. A single year initiated a domino effect of biology, climate change, and economic restructuring that completely rewired our planet. Definitely something to think about the next time you stir a spoonful of sugar into your morning coffee. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the history that shapes our modern world.